Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 76 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks. They took on the Seattle Kraken and lost by a score of 5-1. And honestly, I really thought that the Sharks were going to win here tonight. I don't usually think that because that would be setting myself up for disappointment more often than not, but it just felt as though that the odds were in their favor for this particular game. Clearly, I was wrong, but it was for a few reasons. The first of which is that Seattle, like San Jose, are a team that is mathematically eliminated from the playoffs. They're not desperately trying to hold on to a wild card spot or having already clinched a position and are just generally a really great team. This is an opponent who, like San Jose, might struggle to really find the motivation to play out these last couple of weeks of the season, so I thought the Sharks would be able to take advantage of that. The two other reasons is, first of all, it was also fan appreciation night here in San Jose, and honestly, the Sharks really haven't given fans much to appreciate throughout this season and in years past, and while many of us fans are very understanding of the reasoning for that, because the Sharks are trying to lose these games, tank, get good draft picks so that they can improve into the future, it certainly would have been nice on a sold-out night here at the Shark Tank to be able to pick up a win anyway. But the third and major reason where I really thought that the Sharks would put their best foot forward and at least put up a competitive performance here is that the big story in the Sharks community today as well as yesterday was the Make-A-Wish kid Luke, who really wanted to meet his hero Macklin Celebrini, and they spent the entire day yesterday at practice together. There were a ton of videos that came out, very sweet, very cute videos, and he was also at the game here tonight against Seattle, and I really thought that the Sharks team would really be able to use that as an extra motivation and some energy to come out here and play really well, and as I said, I was clearly wrong. Well, I do think that the score here is not fully indicative of how this game went. I don't think it was so heavily lopsided in favor of Seattle. It is still a game that the Sharks just simply didn't play all that well in and likely deserved this loss. It started out not quite that way in the first period. The Sharks had the first few shots of this game, were playing decently well. The shots weren't of the high caliber, super dangerous variety, but still, when you're taking shots, the other team isn't. And yet, Seattle does end up striking first on a goal from Jared McCann. He makes it 1-0. Then it is Burakovsky who makes it 2-0 before Will Smith is able to cut into that lead near the end of the first period. It is a 2-1 game after 20 minutes. At this point in the first intermission, I imagine the messaging is to try and do kind of more of the same thing. All in all, that first period I don't think was terrible for San Jose, and you could certainly make the argument that they were the better team. But then that brings us to the second period where things kind of flip on their side. The Kraken score 3 more goals here to expand a 2-1 lead into a 5-1 lead, which is the score after 40 minutes. In the third period, the Sharks actually end up with a chance to try and claw their way back into this game. They get a 5-on-3, but just as happened against the Ducks a couple of games ago, and then the Los Angeles Kings the game before that, they fail to actually convert, despite a pretty much wide open opportunity for William Eklund on a great one-timer setup from Will Smith. He ends up hitting the post, and so the Sharks, they don't manage even a single goal in this third period, and they lose the game 5-1, and you could see some of the frustration coming out of the team in that last few minutes. William Eklund got into his first career fight with Eli Tolvanen. I never thought I would be able to say those words, but it is something that happened. A couple of players got thrown out with some misconducts, and so generally, clearly frustrations boiling over there in those last few minutes, and you can see why it was not a very good night for the Sharks, despite all the factors that seemed to be in their favor at the beginning of the game. Moving on now before the players to talk about a standings update, which I'm going to spend a little bit more time on because we are getting down now to just 2 more weeks this season. Both teams with just 6 games remaining. The Sharks losing this one in regulation, they remain at 50 points. The Chicago did not play here tonight, but they did play yesterday against Washington. I'm sure many people were watching that game because, of course, Ovechkin not only managed to get within 1 of tying Gretzky, but actually got the game-tying goal as well. His 890 94th of his career, a game in which Chicago actually almost won. They went into the third period with a lead, though they would lose it in regulation and remain at 52 points. So with 6 games remaining on the schedule, it is still pretty close. But I will say here, and I'll explain it why, I do think the Sharks have a pretty good advantage in this, simply because of what is going to end up happening this next week. What games are on the docket for both of these teams? And on the Chicago side, it seems as though their schedule is a good bit easier. This upcoming week, starting tomorrow, they will be playing against the Pittsburgh Penguins twice, as well as the Boston Bruins. Now, the Penguins are kind of an unpredictable team. They can beat some of the best, like they did just today, taking out the Dallas Stars, who had been on a bit of a hot streak as of late, but they can also just lose to pretty much anyone on any given night. And so I think in a sort of back-to-back there against the same team, Chicago at least has a chance of picking up 2 points, picking up a win. As I mentioned, they played a close game against Washington, a close game against Colorado, and against Vegas. They've been looking a little bit better as of late, so I wouldn't be that surprised if they could pick up a win there. And then they also have a matchup against Boston, who's kind of been spiraling. They did pick up a huge win against Carolina today off the 5-point night from David Pastrnak, but that's not usually something that's going to happen, and so it's certainly possible that Chicago could at least win one of their next 3 games, maybe even 2 of them, which would put them in a much higher position. And remember, the Sharks do have the tiebreaker here in the sense that they will finish below Chicago in the standings if they're tied in points. So this upcoming week is going to really be the deciding factor as long as things go as expected, because on the Sharks side, they also play 3 games, but they are a lot more difficult. On Monday, San Jose will face off against Calgary, a team desperately trying to find their way into the playoff picture here, that last wildcard spot in the Western Conference. So you would expect them to bring their A game. Then there is Minnesota a couple of days after that, a team desperately trying to hang on to the last wildcard spot in the Western Conference. You would expect them to also bring their A game. And then at the end of the week, it is another matchup with the Edmonton Oilers. Hard to say how difficult that will be, because we don't know what the fate of both McDavid and Draisaitl will end up being. They are a very, very weaker team with those players out of the lineup, but perhaps they could end up returning, making it so it is quite possible for the Sharks to go 0-3 over these next 3 games, which would put them in a very good position to almost lock down that last place spot. Finally, now moving on to the players to talk about, we have the Sharks top line of Will Smith, Celebrini, and Toffoli. No lineup changes for this game yet again, which is somewhat of a surprise, besides in goal, although that didn't really even end up being a lineup change. So starting off with Celebrini, I mentioned the sort of Make-A-Wish kid situation back at the beginning, that I really thought it would give the team as a whole some extra energy, and that didn't quite end up happening. But obviously Celebrini being the guy who Luke really wanted to meet, it did seem to give Celebrini some extra jump. This felt like the most Celebrini-esque game that we have seen from him in these last couple of weeks. A lot more just offense being created by him, playing with a lot more energy. It didn't fully carry over into, let's say, the latter parts of this game. Felt as though it kind of trended downwards a little bit, but certainly back at the beginning, the first period especially, he was just all over it, making some great chances happen. He picks up a secondary assist on this Will Smith goal, and so I would say Celebrini had a pretty good outing, all things considered. When it comes to his 2 line mates, to now go to Will Smith, I had mentioned in my review last game that Will Smith, it seemed as though there was a message from the coaching staff for Smith to try and get to the middle of the ice more, to try and crash to the net. He was doing that many times against the Edmonton Oilers. And the big thing that I think was very important here is that what we see on his goal is that it stems from exactly that. Him heading to the net, he's able to tap home this rebound. And it's such an important factor that this does end up occurring, because it's one thing for a coach to tell you, yeah, we need you to go to the middle of the ice more, we need you to get to the net, and it's great to see that Will Smith is very receptive to this feedback and is actually willing to put it into action, but you also want that kind of positive reinforcement. You want that if they are doing the things that you are saying for them to actually be rewarded for it. And so to see Smith pretty much in just like the second game where you see this notable change in his game, to actually get that goal and the only one that the Sharks actually scored here, I think that is a very, very good thing. Now, this isn't something that's going to be fully limiting his other passing style. We saw many of those playmaking moments for him here tonight, but it's just simply about adding that extra element to his game, and it worked out rather well here. And then finally, the last player on this line being Tyler Toffoli. Another game in which he did have bunch of chances, honestly, 2-3 opportunities to be able to get his 29th of the year, but did get robbed by Decord a couple of times, picks up the primary assist on this Will Smith goal, a player who is certainly benefiting from playing with the two creative players on this team, both Celebrini and Smith. Toffoli always the type of guy who you never really know if he's going to have like a really great game or somewhat quiet. Here tonight, it was that pretty good one. And then when it comes to the Sharks' second line, we have Eklund with Wenberg and Graf. I'll start off with William Eklund. As I mentioned, the first career fighting major. This probably won't happen all that much throughout his career. Again, it is the frustrations that are definitely coming into play, and this also really wasn't much of a fight with two guys who aren't really used to being in this position, but still, you want to see that type of, energy out of a particular player. I actually thought this was a fine night for Eklund. I don't think he did a ton of great things, but I also don't think he was terrible either. He generally had some strong shifts, especially near the early parts of this game. When it comes to Alex Wenberg, he probably was the best player on this second line. I did like Wenberg's performance throughout this night, not even just from an offensive perspective where he continues to be a strong driving force for this group, but also just defensively making some good plays. And then when it comes to Colin Graf, perhaps the slight weak link of this line, some solid penalty killing coming out from Graf, so that is a good thing. The Sharks penalty kill managed to shut down Seattle, didn't give up a goal in that area. But from an offensive perspective, playing in this top six, you do want to see a little bit more from him. Then we move on to the Sharks' third line, where we have Grundstrom with Ty Dellandrea and Cam Lund. Definitely a rough game for this third line as a whole, and in particular Cam Lund, not the greatest night for him. Just in his, sixth game here in the NHL, it's not that much of a surprise that at some point he'll struggle, and it definitely stands out here in particular on this Burakovsky goal. He gives the puck away behind the net, and then in an attempt to kind of correct his own mistake, he gets way too zeroed in on the puck carrier, loses himself in the defensive zone, and that leaves Burakovsky all alone in the slot to get this shot and to get this goal. I won't really call this a rookie mistake or anything, because he's certainly not the first player to give the puck away and then try to overcorrect by chasing after it. We see this many times from young and older players alike, and so it's just something that Cam Lund will have to learn from. Then when it comes to his two line mates, Carl Grundstrom, there was one chance that he got early on in this game, and then otherwise just not very good. He's caught not being able to back check in time to be able to get back for this first Jared McCann goal. He's on the ice for many of these goals against, as was the entirety of this third line, and he actually even ends up getting swapped down to the fourth line in favor of Noah Gregor, so Warsofsky perhaps sending a message there as well. And then when it comes to Ty Dellandrea, noted physicality that he had near the end of this game, laying a big hit onto Burakovsky in those last couple of minutes. Perhaps a bit of a kneeing there that it doesn't end up getting called, but perhaps also something that maybe Ryan Warsofsky is encouraging. I'm sure he loves the physical play, but otherwise he didn't actually do much in this game. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, we have Gregor with Stapchuk and Goodrow. I mentioned that Gregor gets the swap with Grundstrom, moves up to that third line. In the case of Noah Gregor, it is no secret that I don't think he's a particularly good player, nor that I don't think he should even be in the lineup here on a consistent basis with guys like Kovalenko waiting on the sidelines. But credit where credit is due, Gregor had a noticeable night here tonight. It is known that basically the major quality that Gregor is actually able to bring to an NHL lineup is his speed. For those of us who watched Gregor with the Sharks in his first go-around on the team a few years ago, that was obviously the major part that actually stood out in a big way. The amount of chances and breakaways and 2-on-1s that he would get thanks to his speed, and that he would just not be able to score on because he doesn't quite have much skill to be able to finish off on those plays, was astounding. And here tonight, he was able to use it a few times on a couple of these shifts in which he's pushing back the defense. He created a good chance for Ostapchuk, who ended up getting his first shot on goal as a San Jose Shark. So Gregor, I guess, had an okay night. And then when it comes to Ostapchuk, like I said, this was a stat I actually learned today, but it doesn't actually surprise me one bit that Ostapchuk in his first 8 games as a Shark did not have a singular shot on goal, but he gets not 1 but 2 in this game. So he infinitely multiplies his previous shot that was at a grand total of 0, which I guess is good. And actually this first shot came relatively close. It was from a decent scoring position. And then when it comes to Barclay Goodrow, some okay penalty killing from him, but not much else to write home about, which just generally brings me to yet another point that I've mentioned many times in the past and that I will continue to really go on, which is just that this bottom 6 is pretty discouraging to actually watch. I mean, I'm trying to grasp at straws here to find any sort of positives. The fact that I'm saying, ooh, Ostapchuk, he gets his first 2 shots as a Shark, go him, or Noah Gregor shows a couple of, his wheels on full display here on a couple of these shifts. Like, these are supposed to be the positives that I'm highlighting while the team is just scoring only singular goals in many of these games because they're just not getting any sort of offense from half of their forward group. It's just not a very good look. And again, it is fully self-inflicted because the Sharks very clearly had other options currently on the team, or at least within the organization, that they have overlooked time and time again for players who already back in October and November were showing that they are not going to be guys contributing offensively in any sort of way, and have continued to do so all season long to now we are in early April with just 2 weeks to go in the season, and yet Warsofsky keeps going back to that same group of players and saying, well, maybe this next time it'll go well. And then finally we get to the Sharks' defense. Now we have the top pairing of Ferraro and Liljegren. To start off with Mario Ferraro, generally I actually thought Ferraro was perhaps the Sharks' best defenseman. Now this is mostly because, yet again, from an offensive perspective, he was joining the rush, jumping up into the play, getting active. You could see on the 1 goal that the Sharks did score from Will Smith, right behind him was actually Mario Ferraro creeping down from the point, trying to get open for that passing opportunity. You really like to see Ferraro actually being able to just try and step into this role. Now that Jake Wallman is gone, it was expected maybe Liljegren would be that guy. Maybe Mukhamadullin, when he was healthy, was definitely trying to be that guy. But now Mukhamadullin's out, Wallman is gone. Nobody else really is going to be trying to take out those shoes, or fill those shoes, I should say. And Ferraro attempting to do so, and honestly looking pretty good while doing it. Defensively, I'll still say there's obvious issues that exist, but all in all, when you consider the offensive side of things, I think he had an alright game. And when it comes to his defensive partner Liljegren, a little bit worse, I would say. He didn't quite have the offense to actually make up for some of the defensive inconsistencies in his game here tonight. I don't think he was the worst defenseman for the Sharks, but he didn't necessarily help them a ton. When it comes to the Sharks' second defensive pairing, next with Lucas Carlsson, as I mentioned in my last review, now that the offense has dried up from those first couple of games, what we are noticing here is that Carlsson is just not quite at that NHL level when it comes to actually playing defense. We've seen him in these split-second decisions just make the incorrect call. It happened exactly in the Anaheim game against the Sam Colangelo goal, if I'm not mistaken, where he ends up covering the incorrect player, leaving someone all alone in front. He does the exact same thing on this second Jared McCann goal. I don't think that this was a smart choice with him trying to stick with Shane Wright, because Liljegren now has to cut across, which is just not going to be able to happen, and McCann has more time than he should have to be able to take this shot. So not a huge fan of what Carlsson was doing or has been doing. When it comes to his defensive partner, Jack Thompson, however, I actually thought Thompson was okay. Not a great game for him or anything like that, but just generally because it wasn't a great game for the Sharks as a whole. But there weren't too many errors that I noticed from Thompson, so I guess it was a decent night. And when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, Marc-Edouard Vlasic at first, kind of a Vlasic style of game, maybe a little bit below average than what we are expecting. A couple of smaller mistakes being made, but all in all, I don't think you can be super critical of him. His defensive partner, on the other other hand, Henry Thrun, that is much more so of an issue. Obviously, the big one that stands out is his giveaway on the Jaden Schwartz goal, which was the fourth of this game, a situation in which he just kind of tries to play this one forward, deflects off of a body, comes back the other way, Schwartz, breakaway chance, and the goal in the back of the net. This is the type of mistake that I would normally be able to kind of overlook if your night is otherwise filled with solid play. For instance, before Mukhamadullin was injured, he could have these types of bad giveaways, so unfortunate type of situations, but when 90% of his other game is actually still pretty good, I would come all around and say, yeah, I think he had a decent night. But the problem here with Henry Thrun is that this is just the tip of the iceberg here with his issues in this game. He otherwise was still kind of bad. And so when you're kind of playing bad, when you do make these types of mistakes, they are a lot more difficult to overlook and instead are just the cherry on top of a very bad night. And I mentioned in my last review that Thrun is probably the one defenseman out of all of these six who really well and truly is trying to fight for this roster spot going into next season. Maybe Thompson as well, but definitely Henry Thrun. And right now, he's losing that battle to pretty much nobody because nobody else here is actually going for that spot. And then finally we have the Sharks goaltenders, because we did get to see both of them here in this game. Starting off was Georgiev. He missed the last game due to injury, but obviously not long term. He steps between the pipes here. And I think you could come at this in two different directions. If you are an optimist and you want to view the positive side of things here when it comes to Georgiev, you can look at all four of these goals that he did let in and say, well, these are on some higher danger chances, right? The McCann goal in the slot, same goes for the Burakovsky goal. Then the Stevenson one is 2-on-1 and the Schwartz goal is a breakaway. Those are all four opportunities that are not going to be an easy save in a vacuum. But when you contextualize it in this game, these are four chances on just 11 shots. They're basically the only four good chances, more or less, than the Seattle Kraken actually got with Georgiev in the net, and he could not come up with the big save on any single one of them. And the Schwartz goal, while it was a breakaway, this wasn't a hugely difficult shot to stop either, and that was the one that ends up ending his night. And so, on the more so negative side of things, those are the arguments that you could give. It is a Georgiev type of night, and so he does get yanked in favor of Romanov. He was the goaltender in the previous game against the Edmonton Oilers, where he had a solid outing. And here tonight, in relief, sometimes it can be an easier situation for goalies because the other team will sometimes just end up letting up a bit. But that's not quite what ended up happening here. He lets in this fifth goal of the game from McCann. I believe it did deflect on its way in, so I won't put too much blame on Romanov. And in the third period, Seattle was continuing to push, trying to run up the score here a little bit, trying to get more goals, and Romanov had to be up to the challenge many times, especially on that 4-minute power play that they did get. And with those saves, the question now becomes, going into the game on Monday against Calgary, does Georgiev still end up getting the start? I would have thought normally yes, but with how Romanov has looked here in relief as well as in that last game, the decision is not as obvious. I wouldn't be surprised that if Georgiev does get another chance, I certainly wouldn't bet on Romanov starting, but the fact that it is a conversation is quite interesting. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action, like I said, on Monday against the Calgary Flames, a very, very desperate team. They actually did lose in overtime against the Vegas Golden Knights today, and so they remain 4 points out of a playoff spot behind the Minnesota Wild with one game in hand. So technically they are not in control of their own destiny because of this. However, you would expect that they are going to be bringing their absolute A game in any sort of opportunity here, and going up against a weak San Jose Sharks team, it could be a game that if they want to even hang around in, San Jose will have to be at their best as well. Class dismissed.